Why is everyone being weird about my apartment? It was a two-bedroom with huge windows and brand new appliances in downtown for an unbelievable price. When I called the landlord, he said, "It's been a struggle to rent out for obvious reasons," and kept apologizing like something was wrong with it. When I said I'd take it, he paused at me for a long time before saying, "Seriously?" I had no idea what he meant, but I signed the lease that afternoon. My friend Josh came to help me move, and when I opened the door to show him the place, he literally backed into the hallway. He asked why I would rent this place, and when I asked what was wrong with it, he just kept shaking his head saying, "Dude, you know what's wrong with it." He helped me carry boxes, but refused to come inside and left everything in the hallway for me to bring in myself. My girlfriend Ruby came over that night with a housewarming gift, but stopped in the doorway like there was an invisible wall. She asked if I was pranking her, and when I said no, she started crying. Actual tears, saying she couldn't believe I'd chosen to live here. She said she'd wait for me in the car while I got my things, because she couldn't stay another second, and we ended up going to her place instead. I Googled the address looking for murders or deaths, but found nothing except normal rental listings going back years. I checked crime statistics for the neighborhood, and it was one of the safest in the city. I searched for structural problems or lawsuits or anything that would explain why everyone acted like my apartment was cursed but came up completely empty. My parents drove up to visit, and my mom physically recoiled when she walked in. My dad pulled me aside and asked if I was having financial troubles because surely I could afford something better than this. When I told him this was actually expensive for me, he said, "Son, no amount of savings is worth living in a place like this," but wouldn't explain what he meant. I started inviting people over just to see their reactions, and every single person had the same response of absolute horror. My coworker Zoe said it was the worst apartment she'd ever seen. My neighbor from across the hall asked why I would do this to myself. The pizza delivery guy asked if I was being held here against my will and offered to call someone for me. I wondered if maybe there was something wrong with how it smelled that I'd gotten used to, so I bought air quality meters and had professional testing done. Everything came back normal with no mold or gas leaks or chemical problems. I hired a home inspector who said structurally it was one of the soundest apartments he'd seen, but he still seemed uncomfortable the entire time he was there. Then I thought maybe someone had died here recently, so I talked to the other tenants in the building. The old woman next door said nobody had lived in my apartment for at least 5 years, and she'd never understood why, since it was the nicest unit in the building. The guy downstairs said multiple people had rented it, but nobody ever lasted more than a week, though he didn't know why. I brought in a priest to bless the apartment, thinking maybe people were sensing something supernatural. He walked through every room with his holy water, but said he didn't feel any negative presence, though he admitted he wouldn't want to live here himself. When I asked why, he just said, "You really don't feel it," and left without explaining. Ruby finally agreed to try staying over, but she couldn't sleep, and spent the whole night sitting in a chair fully dressed. In the morning, she said she couldn't date someone who chose to live in a place like this because it said something about my judgment. She broke up with me that day, saying she'd tried to be supportive but couldn't handle it anymore. I contacted previous tenants through old rental records, and one guy named Miles agreed to talk to me. He said he'd lasted 3 days before moving out and forfeiting his deposit. When I asked what was wrong with the apartment, he said, "If you don't know, then I can't explain it, but nobody should live there." He said 4 other people he knew had also tried to rent it over the years, and none of them could handle it. After 3 months, I'd gotten used to people refusing to visit and having to meet everyone at coffee shops or their places. The landlord called to check if I was still there, and when I said yes, he sounded shocked. He said I was the longest tenant he'd had in that unit since 2018 and offered to reduce my rent to $600 if I'd stay through the year. I asked him point blank what was wrong with the apartment, and he was quiet for a long time before saying he'd tried to fix it but couldn't. When I asked what he'd tried to fix, he said the previous owner had warned him about the apartment but hadn't explained the problem either. He said he'd sell me the whole building for half its value if I wanted it because he just wanted to be done with it. I was thinking about it when I found a note under my door that just said, "We need to talk about your apartment," with a phone number. When I called, the woman who answered wouldn't tell me her name, but said she'd been tracking everyone who'd lived in my unit for the past 15 years. She said I was different from all the others, and when I asked her what she meant, she started to cry. She took this shaky breath on the phone and told me we needed to meet in person to explain everything. She suggested a coffee shop downtown tomorrow afternoon, somewhere public and safe for both of us. I agreed right away because I was desperate for any answers about my apartment. After hanging up, I grabbed a notebook and started making a list of every weird reaction people had to my place. The list filled 3 whole pages with 47 different times people refused to come in or ran away. Josh backing into the hallway that first day. Ruby crying at the doorway. My mom physically pulling back when she walked in. My dad asking about my finances. The pizza guy offering to call for help. Every coworker who visited and left immediately. All the delivery people who wouldn't cross the threshold. The priest who blessed it but wouldn't stay. Miles lasting only 3 days. The home inspector being uncomfortable the whole time. The old woman next door saying nobody understood why it stayed empty. The guy downstairs mentioning people never lasted more than a week. Writing it all down made the pattern even more obvious. That night, I walked through every room real slow, trying to feel whatever made everyone else so scared. I pressed my hands against the walls, feeling for vibrations or cold spots. I stood in each corner, breathing deep to catch any weird smells. I turned off all the lights to see if anything glowed or moved in the dark. I laid on the floor in the living room, listening for sounds in the walls or ceiling. I checked behind every piece of furniture and inside every closet and cabinet. I ran my fingers along the window frames, looking for gaps or damage. I examined the electrical outlets and light switches for burn marks or strange wiring. I even got down and looked at the baseboards and under the radiators with a flashlight. But it all just felt like home to me. Comfortable and normal and safe. The next afternoon, I left an hour early and walked to the coffee shop to calm my nerves. I picked a corner table where I could watch the door and ordered a black coffee that I was too anxious to drink. My hands were shaking a little as I watched people come and go. Every time the door opened, I wondered if it was her. I kept checking my phone even though she hadn't texted. I'd written down a bunch of questions in my notebook about the apartment. After what felt like forever, this woman in her 50s walked in carrying a thick brown folder. She looked around the coffee shop until her eyes landed on me in the corner. She walked over real careful, like she was nervous too, and asked if I was the tenant from Unit 4B. When I said yes, she dropped into the chair across from me like her legs gave out. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept in days. She wouldn't tell me her name, but opened the folder and spread papers across the table. There were spreadsheets with columns for dates and names and how long people stayed. Every single tenant of my unit going back 15 years was documented on these pages. Move-in dates, move-out dates, and notes about what they experienced in the apartment. The longest anyone lasted before me was 11 days back in 2016. Most people left within 3 or 4 days. Some only made it hours. She pointed to an entry from 2009 and her voice got quiet. She told me that was her sister who'd moved into my apartment that summer. Within 2 days, her sister started having severe anxiety and couldn't eat or sleep. By day 4, she was having panic attacks every few hours. On day 6, she moved out and went to stay with friends. Her sister never got better after leaving the apartment. 8 months later, she died from an overdose that everyone said was intentional. I asked what was wrong with the apartment, and she just shook her head. She said nobody could explain it right because it didn't make sense. People felt this crushing dread and physical pain and needed to escape immediately. But I was somehow immune to whatever caused it. She pulled out printed emails from a folder pocket and laid them out for me to read. Former tenants describing chest pressure that made it hard to breathe. Metallic tastes in their mouths that wouldn't go away. Nightmares every single night about walls closing in. Feeling watched even when alone in the bathroom. Headaches that started the moment they entered and stopped when they left. Nausea that got worse the longer they stayed inside. One person wrote about their hair falling out in clumps after 5 days. Another said their vision went blurry until they moved out. The descriptions were all so similar, even though these people never met or talked to each other. I told her about all the tests I'd done trying to figure out the problem. The air quality meters showing everything was normal. The professional testing finding no mold or gas leaks or chemicals. The home inspector saying it was structurally perfect. Even the priest who blessed every room but found no evil presence. She nodded like she already knew and pulled out another sheet. 12 other tenants had tried the exact same tests over the years with the same results. Everything always came back completely normal, with no explanation for what people felt. She pushed a small piece of paper across the table with an email address written in neat handwriting and told me to send her everything I noticed about the apartment. I folded it into my wallet while she gathered up all the papers and stuffed them back into the folder. She wanted me to document every detail, no matter how small or stupid it seemed, because maybe I'd noticed something everyone else missed. The coffee had gone cold, but neither of us had touched our cups anyway. She stood up and said she'd be checking her email every day, waiting for my observations. I watched her walk out and get into an old Toyota before driving away. Back at my apartment, I grabbed a notebook from the kitchen drawer and started writing down everything about the place. The date was March 15th, and it was 60 degrees outside with no wind. I walked through each room writing what I saw and felt and smelled. The living room had afternoon sun coming through the huge windows, making squares on the hardwood floor. My skin felt normal, and my breathing was regular, and I didn't taste anything weird in my mouth. I made columns in the notebook for date and time and weather and physical sensations, and decided to update it every few hours. Then I opened my laptop and created a spreadsheet to track every person who came near the apartment. I put columns for their name and how long they stayed and what their reaction was and any specific things they said or did. Looking at the empty rows made me realize how few people had been here since I moved in 3 months ago. I typed up an email to my parents explaining that I was trying to figure out what was wrong with the apartment and needed their help. I asked them to describe exactly what they felt when they visited and to be as specific as possible about the physical sensations. Mom wrote back within an hour saying she'd felt this crushing weight on her chest the moment she walked through the door. She said it was like the air was too thick to breathe, and her heart started racing for no reason. She kept feeling like something terrible was about to happen, even though she could see everything was fine. Dad's email came later that night, and he described feeling trapped like the walls were slowly moving closer. He said his ears felt full, like when a plane takes off, and he had this urgent need to get outside immediately. He apologized for not being able to explain it better, but said it was the worst feeling he'd ever experienced in a building. 3 days passed with me updating my notebook every few hours and not finding anything unusual about the apartment. Then I got an email from the woman with a bunch of links to scientific articles about something called infrasound. The articles explained how sound waves below what humans can hear could still affect our bodies and make us feel scared or sick. One study showed that certain frequencies around 7 or 8 hertz could cause anxiety and dread, and even make people see shadows in their peripheral vision. She wondered if maybe the building design was creating these low frequencies when the wind hit it just right or the heating system turned on. I spent the rest of the day reading about infrasound and how it could come from all kinds of sources like fans or pipes or even the shape of a room. I found a special microphone online that could detect these super low frequencies and ordered it with express shipping. While waiting for it to arrive, I started paying more attention to my neighbors and noticed the old woman next door never seemed bothered when she walked past my open door. She'd smile and wave like everything was normal while other people in the hallway would speed up or look uncomfortable. I knocked on her door one afternoon and asked if she'd ever felt anything weird near my apartment. She touched her hearing aids and laughed, saying she was practically deaf, so she probably wouldn't notice whatever everyone else was feeling. She said she'd lived here for 20 years, and my unit had always been hard to rent, but she never understood why, since it was the nicest one in the building. Her comment about being deaf stuck in my head because if the problem was sound-related, then maybe she couldn't hear or feel it. The microphone arrived 2 days later in a small box with instructions for connecting it to my laptop. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. I downloaded the Analysis app and spent the entire weekend taking recordings in every room at different times. I'd set it up in the bedroom for an hour, then move it to the kitchen, then the bathroom, then the living room. The data started showing these occasional spikes in the low frequencies, especially when the wind picked up outside. Sunday afternoon, when the wind was really strong, the readings showed a clear pattern around 7 hertz, which was exactly in the range that could cause fear responses. I put everything into a detailed report with graphs and timestamps and sent it to the woman. She forwarded it to someone she knew who worked as an acoustic engineer, and he replied saying the readings looked like something called Helmholtz resonance. He explained that the building might be acting like a giant whistle when wind hit it at certain angles, and the sound was at a frequency most people could feel but not hear. Monday morning, the landlord called to check if I was still living in the apartment, and when I said yes, he sounded shocked again. He offered to drop my rent to $500 a month if I'd sign a 2-year lease right away. I told him I might have figured out what was wrong with the apartment and asked if he'd pay for professional acoustic testing. The line went quiet for a long time before he said he couldn't afford any more investigations into the problem. He'd already spent thousands trying to fix whatever was wrong, and nothing had worked. After hanging up, I went online and started researching the building's history through city records. I found the original building permits from 1978 and noticed something weird in the ventilation plans. The architect had designed a special air chase that ran behind all the north-facing apartments to improve airflow. The chase was basically a hollow channel that connected all the units on that side of the building. If wind hit the building just right, it could turn that whole chase into a resonance chamber, creating infrasound that would affect everyone in those apartments. 2 weeks went by before I got an email from the woman with a subject line that just said, "Found more." She'd tracked down 3 former tenants who were willing to talk about their experiences in my apartment. One guy mentioned something interesting about how the discomfort got way worse on windy days. That matched perfectly with the frequency data I'd been collecting for weeks. I spent the next few days calling acoustic consultants until I found one named Harry Solomon, who didn't hang up when I explained the situation. He was skeptical, but when I offered to pay half his fee up front, he agreed to bring specialized equipment to test the apartment. While waiting for Harry's visit, I decided to try my own experiment with foam panels from the music store. I bought 12 panels and some heavy blackout curtains to see if I could dampen whatever resonance was happening. Josh agreed to be my test subject even though he still refused to actually come inside. I hung the panels on the walls and put up the curtains, then called him over. He stood at the doorway for about 30 seconds before shaking his head. He said the awful feeling was maybe 20% less intense, but still unbearable. Harry showed up the following Tuesday evening carrying 3 metal cases of equipment. The wind was already picking up outside, which he said would be perfect for testing. As soon as he stepped through the door, he stopped and looked around with this uncomfortable expression. He said something definitely felt off, but he couldn't explain what exactly. We spent the next hour setting up monitors in every room while he explained how infrasound affects the human body. He had devices that looked like small black boxes with antennas sticking out. He placed one in each corner of the living room and bedroom, then set up a laptop on my kitchen table. Around 8 o'clock, the wind really started howling outside, and suddenly all his equipment lit up like a Christmas tree. The laptop screen showed these massive spikes in a frequency he said was exactly 7 hertz. Harry got excited and started taking readings from different spots in the apartment. He explained that 7 Hz is known to cause fear and discomfort in most people because it matches the resonance frequency of human eyeballs. Some people just aren't sensitive to it, which explained why I could live here without problems. He spent another hour tracing the source with some kind of directional sensor that looked like a metal wand. Eventually, he pointed at the wall behind my couch where the ventilation chase was located. He said the chase was acting like a giant organ pipe when wind hit the building at certain angles. The whole thing was basically turning my apartment into a fear machine. Harry did some calculations on his laptop and estimated that professional acoustic treatment would cost about $8,000. He said they could install special baffles and dampening material that would reduce the resonance by 70%. I asked if that would make it completely normal, and he shook his head, saying nothing could eliminate it entirely. The building's design was fundamentally flawed, but they could make it bearable for most people. I typed up Harry's entire report and emailed it to the landlord that same night. My phone rang within 5 minutes, and the landlord sounded panicked. He admitted he'd known about the sound issue for years, but previous attempts to fix it had failed. He'd tried different contractors and spent thousands already with no improvement. Then he made an offer that surprised me. He said he'd pay for the full treatment if I signed a non-disclosure agreement and promised not to sue. He wanted this problem to go away quietly without any legal trouble or bad publicity. I told him I needed time to think about it and hung up. The next morning, I forwarded everything to the woman who'd been tracking the apartment. She called me immediately, and for the first time told me her real name was Roberta Lynch. She was furious when I explained the landlord's offer. She said he'd been knowingly renting an uninhabitable apartment to people for years. We should report him to housing authorities and maybe even the police for fraud. She couldn't believe he wanted me to stay quiet after all the suffering he'd caused. I spent the next week going back and forth on what to do. Every morning I'd wake up in my apartment knowing it was basically torture for normal people. I made lists of pros and cons, but couldn't decide if taking the fix was selfish or practical. On one hand, the landlord had deceived dozens of tenants over the years. On the other hand, reporting him wouldn't fix the apartment, and I'd have to move. Plus, the $8,000 treatment could help future tenants, even if I had to keep quiet about why it was done. My phone buzzed with a text from Ruby, asking if I ever figured out what was wrong with the apartment. I sent her Harry's full report with all the technical details about the 7 Hz frequency. She replied within minutes, saying she was glad there was finally an explanation. She couldn't believe I'd stayed there so long knowing something was wrong, even if I couldn't feel it myself. I called 3 lawyers that week and made an appointment with the one who actually answered her phone instead of having an assistant screen calls. Her office was in a small strip mall between a nail salon and a tax prep place, and when I walked in, she was eating a sandwich at her desk while typing on her laptop. She waved me to sit down and kept chewing while I explained the whole situation with the apartment and the landlord's offer to pay for acoustic treatment if I signed an NDA. She put down her sandwich and pulled up something on her computer, then turned the screen toward me, showing similar cases where landlords had rented out places with known problems. She said the NDA would probably hold up in court, but the landlord could be looking at criminal fraud charges for knowingly renting an uninhabitable unit to dozens of tenants over the years. She told me to document everything I had, every email and text and phone record, before making any decision about the NDA. I paid her consultation fee and left with a folder full of printouts about tenant rights and fraud statutes. 2 days later, I was taking out my trash when Melvin Steele from maintenance stopped me in the hallway. He'd been fixing something in the basement and mentioned he'd always noticed the building hummed on certain nights, especially when the wind picked up. He'd thought it was the old boiler system, but after hearing about my apartment situation from the old woman next door, he wondered if the hum was related to what everyone felt in my unit. He said he'd worked in the building for 8 years, and my apartment had always been a problem, with people moving out almost immediately and the landlord constantly trying different fixes that never worked. That night, I sat at my computer and started building a website with everything we'd found so far. I uploaded Harry's acoustic report with all the technical data about the 7 Hz frequency, then added anonymized quotes from the former tenants Roberta had tracked down over the years. I included the frequency measurements I'd taken myself and created a timeline showing how long each tenant had lasted in the apartment going back 15 years. I didn't publish the site yet, but having everything organized in one place helped me see the full scope of what had been happening. The landlord must have been getting nervous because he called the next morning and increased his offer to cover the full $8,000 acoustic treatment, plus give me a year of free rent if I'd sign the NDA. He sounded desperate and mentioned he'd been trying to sell the building for 5 years, but every deal fell through when potential buyers learned about the problem unit. He said he just wanted this nightmare to end and would do whatever it took to make me happy if I'd keep quiet about it. Roberta wasn't happy when I told her about the increased offer, but she had her own plan. She took me to meet with a tenant advocacy group downtown that wanted to use my apartment as a test case for requiring acoustic testing in all rental properties. The group's director showed me draft legislation they were pushing that would mandate frequency testing along with standard safety inspections. They offered to cover all my legal costs if I was willing to go public with the story and testify at city council meetings about my experience. The meeting lasted 2 hours with them showing me similar cases from other cities where infrared had been discovered in apartments and office buildings. As I walked home, I realized I hadn't had anyone over to my place in 4 months. The isolation was hitting me harder than I'd admitted, always having to meet friends at coffee shops or go to their apartments instead of inviting them to mine. I started browsing rental listings that night, and everything in my price range was either a studio, had no windows, or was an hour outside the city. My current place would be perfect, if not for the infrared issue that made everyone else feel like they were dying. I was comparing apartment listings when Harry sent an email with a cheaper solution he'd been working on. Instead of the full acoustic treatment, he could install a series of baffles in the vent chase for about $3,000 that would reduce the resonance by 50%. He admitted it wouldn't eliminate the problem completely, but it might make the apartment bearable enough for short visits from friends and family. The solution wasn't perfect, but it was better than nothing, and wouldn't require tearing apart the walls. I forwarded Harry's proposal to the landlord, who called back within 10 minutes and agreed immediately. He said he'd schedule the work for next week and still wanted the NDA, but I pushed back and negotiated it down to just agreeing not to post anything online or talk to media about the building. He could live with that as long as I didn't actively publicize the problem. The installation crew showed up Monday morning with boxes of acoustic baffles and rolls of mass-loaded vinyl. They spent 2 days cutting open the wall behind my couch to access the vent chase, and the whole apartment smelled like construction adhesive and drywall dust. Workers installed metal brackets to hold the baffles in place and sealed every gap with acoustic caulk while I worked from coffee shops to avoid the noise and fumes. They patched the wall on Wednesday afternoon and said the paint would need a few days to fully dry. Harry came back Friday evening with his testing equipment to measure the results. He set up the same monitors in each room, and we waited for the wind to pick up while he explained that the baffles should interrupt the standing wave pattern that had been creating the 7 Hz frequency. Around 7, the wind started gusting, and his equipment showed the infrared was reduced by about 60%, down from dangerous levels to merely uncomfortable for most people. He said it wasn't perfect, but should significantly decrease the awful feeling most people experienced in the apartment. The next weekend, I texted Josh asking if he wanted to test out the changes since he'd been the first person to refuse entering when I moved in. He showed up Saturday afternoon carrying a 6-pack and stood in the hallway for a full minute before taking a deep breath and stepping through my door. His whole body tensed up like he was walking into a freezer, but he made it 3 steps into the living room before stopping. He looked around with wide eyes and said it wasn't as bad as before, but still felt wrong somehow. We stood there counting seconds, and he made it to 5 minutes before backing toward the door saying he needed air. Outside in the hallway, he leaned against the wall, breathing hard, but admitted the crushing feeling wasn't as strong as the first time. I marked it down in my notebook as a partial success, while he headed home still shaking his head. That evening, Roberta called after I'd emailed her about Josh's visit and the acoustic work. She went quiet for a long time before saying she was disappointed I'd taken the landlord's deal instead of going public. I explained about the money and needing a place to live, and she said she understood even if she didn't agree. She asked me to at least keep documenting everything in case future tenants needed the information, which I promised to do. We talked for another 20 minutes about the infrared frequencies, and she mentioned finding 3 more former tenants who'd described the same awful sensations. My parents drove up the following weekend to see if the improvements made any difference. Mom walked in holding Dad's hand and managed to sit on my couch, though her face stayed tight with discomfort. She lasted almost exactly 30 minutes before standing up and saying she needed to leave. Dad sat in my kitchen chair for a bit longer and said it still felt wrong, but not like the walls were attacking him anymore, which was the most specific description he'd ever given. They took me out for lunch instead of staying, and Mom kept patting my arm saying she was glad I'd figured out the problem, even if the solution wasn't perfect. Back home, I updated my spreadsheet with everyone's reactions and visit times. The data showed the acoustic treatment had made the apartment tolerable for short visits, but nobody could stay comfortably for more than an hour. The infrared was reduced enough that people could enter but still present enough to affect anyone sensitive to those frequencies. I color-coded the entries and added notes about weather conditions, since wind still made the remaining resonance worse. A month after the treatment, I realized I was sleeping better than I had in months. My usual insomnia had mostly disappeared, and I wondered if the infrared had been affecting me in subtle ways I hadn't consciously noticed. At work, people mentioned I seemed less irritable, and my productivity reports showed improvement. I started tracking my sleep patterns and mood changes in a separate spreadsheet, wondering how much the constant low-frequency exposure had been messing with my brain. One afternoon, the guy from downstairs knocked on my door to thank me for whatever I'd done to fix the vibration. He said he used to feel it through his ceiling on windy nights, but it had mostly stopped after the construction work. His wife's insomnia had gotten much better, and she wasn't taking sleeping pills anymore, which made him emotional as he talked about how long she'd been struggling. I added their improvements to my documentation, thinking about all the people this building had been affecting without anyone understanding why. Ruby finally agreed to visit after I sent her Harry's latest test results showing the frequency reduction. She showed up on a Tuesday evening and managed to walk all the way to my bedroom before the discomfort hit her. She lasted 20 minutes sitting on my couch with her arms wrapped around herself before saying she needed to leave. In the hallway, she said she was proud of me for solving the mystery, but we both knew our relationship couldn't be repaired after everything that had happened. She hugged me goodbye, and we both knew it was really goodbye this time. A few weeks later, I met someone named Amy at a coffee shop who laughed when I warned her about my weird apartment situation. She came over that weekend and managed to stay for 3 hours before the subtle wrongness got to her. She joked that it was like a built-in relationship test, because if someone stayed over, you'd know they really liked you. We started dating and she'd visit for a few hours at a time, though she never stayed overnight. 3 months after the acoustic work, the landlord called to tell me he'd found a buyer for the building. A company wanted to convert it to offices, and they knew about the acoustic issues from Harry's report. They planned to completely gut the ventilation system during renovation, which would finally fix the infrared problem permanently. He sounded relieved to finally be done with the building after years of struggling with the apartment nobody could stand. The sale went through quickly, and 2 weeks later, I got an official notice giving me 6 months to vacate for renovation. The letter was apologetic and offered moving assistance, but I wasn't upset about leaving anymore. I started apartment hunting seriously and found a normal 1-bedroom where Josh could visit without fleeing, and Amy could stay overnight without discomfort. Part of me would miss this strange place despite everything, because it had been home through one of the weirdest periods of my life. Roberta and I spent the next 2 weeks putting together everything we'd learned into one big report. We met at coffee shops with our laptops and stacks of papers, organizing Harry's test results and all the tenant stories we'd collected over months. She knew exactly how to format everything, so the tenant advocacy group would take it seriously. We included graphs showing the infrared frequencies and charts tracking how long each person lasted in the apartment before leaving. The group's leader read through our 60-page report and said this was exactly the kind of evidence they needed to push for new acoustic standards in the building codes. She said most cities didn't even test for infrared during inspections because nobody thought about sounds people couldn't hear. 3 months before my move-out date, I started looking for a new place and found a 1-bedroom apartment about 10 blocks away. The rent was $300 more than what I'd been paying, but when Josh came to check it out with me, he walked right in without hesitating. He sat on the floor of the empty living room and said it felt completely normal, which made me realize how much I'd missed having friends over without warning them first. The landlord of the new place seemed confused when I asked about acoustic issues and said nobody had ever asked him that before. I signed the lease that afternoon and felt relief knowing I'd have somewhere normal to go when the renovation started. A week before moving, I decided to throw a goodbye party for the apartment, but obviously couldn't have it at my place. I booked a table at a Mexican restaurant downtown and invited everyone who'd been part of the whole weird experience. Josh came, and so did my parents and even my old coworker who'd called it the worst apartment she'd ever seen. Everyone kept making jokes about my haunted apartment and asking if I'd missed the ghost. Harry showed up with his wife and told the whole table about the infrared discovery, which had people asking questions about whether their own apartments might have the same problem. Roberta brought cake that said, "Goodbye, apartment 4B," and we all laughed about how insane the whole situation had been. While packing up my bedroom, I found the journal I'd started keeping in those first weeks when nobody would visit. Reading through those early entries made my chest tight seeing how confused and alone I'd been back then. I'd written things like, "Maybe I'm going crazy," and "Why can't anyone else stand being here?" over and over. The investigation had given me something to focus on during those lonely months and led me to Roberta, who'd become an actual friend, not just someone investigating the same mystery. I packed the journal carefully, thinking about how different everything was now that we'd solved it. Harry came by to collect all his monitoring equipment that had been set up in my living room for months. He disconnected the sensors and microphones while telling me he'd submitted a paper about our case to the Journal of Building Acoustics. He said reviewers were really interested because most infrared cases involved old churches or tunnels, not modern apartment buildings. Before leaving, he shook my hand and said I had golden ears just in reverse since I couldn't hear what drove everyone else away. His equipment left rectangular marks on the walls where dust had collected around them. The old woman from next door knocked while I was packing my kitchen and said she'd heard I was moving out. She adjusted her hearing aids and told me I'd been the quietest neighbor she'd had in 20 years. She said she never understood why the apartment stayed empty for so long since it seemed perfectly nice to her. I realized her deafness had protected her from the infrared the same way my weird immunity had protected me. She gave me cookies she'd baked and said whoever moved in after the renovation probably wouldn't be as considerate. On moving day, I walked through the empty apartment one last time with my phone recording video. The huge windows still let in amazing light, and the hardwood floors gleamed just like when I'd first seen the place. Standing in the empty living room, I felt weirdly grateful for everything this apartment had put me through. It taught me to trust my own experience even when everyone said I was wrong. It taught me to investigate and document and not give up when things didn't make sense. It connected me with people like Harry and Roberta who took weird problems seriously. The apartment might have been uninhabitable for most people, but it had been exactly what I needed even if I hadn't known it at the time. Before leaving, I went to the kitchen and opened the drawer where I used to keep my takeout menus. I left a note explaining the infrared problem and Harry's contact information for whoever did the renovation work. Maybe it would help them design something better than the acoustic baffles we'd installed. Maybe they'd find a way to completely eliminate the resonance so future tenants wouldn't have to deal with any of it. I locked the door and dropped my keys in the landlord's mailbox, feeling like I was closing a really strange chapter. Josh met me at my new apartment with his truck full of my boxes. We carried everything up to the third floor, and he immediately sprawled on my new living room floor without any hesitation. We ordered pizza, and the delivery guy handed it over without asking if I needed help escaping. Josh stayed until midnight helping me unpack, and we watched a movie on my laptop sitting on the floor surrounded by boxes. It felt so normal I almost wanted to cry. That first week in the new place, I kept waiting for something to feel wrong, but everything stayed completely regular. I slept through every night without weird dreams or waking up uneasy. My shoulders stopped being tense all the time, and I realized the infrared must have been affecting me in ways I hadn't even noticed. The new apartment was smaller, and the kitchen was older, and the windows weren't nearly as nice. But none of that mattered because people could actually visit me here. 2 weeks later, Roberta sent me an email with photos from the old building showing workers tearing out walls in 3 other units. She wrote that the new owners found the same acoustic problems in apartments 2B and 6B when they started renovation work. The construction foreman told her they were spending almost $200,000 to completely redesign the ventilation system throughout the entire building. I printed out her email and added it to my thick folder of documentation, feeling weirdly satisfied that our research was validated. She invited me to join her informal network of people investigating problem apartments, and I agreed immediately. Over the next few months, I helped 12 different people who contacted her about apartments where everyone felt uncomfortable but couldn't explain why. Most cases turned out to be mold or electrical issues, but 3 had acoustic problems similar to mine. I created detailed guides showing how to test for infrasound using phone apps and cheap microphones. One woman in Seattle had been living in an apartment for 2 years where visitors lasted less than 10 minutes, and her solution ended up being thick rugs and wall hangings that dampened a 9 hertz resonance from the building's elevator shaft. 6 months after moving out, I drove past my old building on the way to meet Amy for lunch. Construction trucks filled the street, and workers were installing massive new ventilation units on the roof. The whole north side of the building was covered in scaffolding with crews replacing the entire vent system that had caused so much trouble. I took photos through my car window thinking about all the previous tenants who suffered without knowing why. Amy laughed when I showed her the pictures at lunch and said my weird immunity to infrasound should be listed as a special skill on dating apps. We'd been together 4 months, and she still found the whole apartment story fascinating, even though I'd told it dozens of times. She said most people would have just moved out immediately, but I had to turn it into a whole investigation. The city council passed Roberta's proposed acoustic standards 3 weeks later, requiring all new construction to include basic frequency testing. The local news covered it as a minor building code update with no mention of haunted apartments or people fleeing in terror. Roberta and I watched the council meeting online, and she said it was a small victory, but could prevent future problems. Harry sent me an email every few months with updates about how my case was used in acoustic engineering courses. He'd written 3 papers about the 4B anomaly and said it was becoming a standard example of how building design can create uninhabitable spaces through sound. Graduate students were using my apartment as a case study for their thesis projects. He attached one paper where a student had created a computer model showing exactly how the wind speed and direction created the specific 7 hertz frequency that affected everyone except me. Life settled into a normal routine where I could have people over without warning them first. Josh came by every weekend to watch games and stayed until midnight without any discomfort. My parents visited and Mom cooked dinner in my kitchen without crying or backing away from invisible walls. The pizza delivery guy handed over my order without offering to call for help. I kept all my documentation in a filing cabinet as proof the whole thing really happened. Sometimes I'd flip through Harry's reports and Roberta's emails and the photos of the acoustic baffles being installed. The apartment that everyone said was cursed had taught me to trust my own experience even when everyone else said something was wrong. I'd made real friends like Roberta who took weird problems seriously instead of dismissing them. Harry still called occasionally to discuss new acoustic discoveries and always thanked me for being patient during his investigation. The whole experience taught me about persistence and documentation and not giving up when things didn't make sense. I learned that sometimes the answer to a mystery is something nobody expects, like sound frequencies below human hearing. The apartment everyone fled from ended up connecting me to a whole network of people solving similar problems. Looking back now, I'm genuinely grateful for those lonely months of isolation and confusion because they led to something useful. I helped prevent other people from going through the same experience, and that made all the frustration worth it.